Me to turn on, so let's give this a try here. I tend to wander around a little bit. If any of you wind up not being able to hear me, swap with somebody up in the front who can hear me all too well. I'm sure they won't mind moving back. Let's talk about shortleaf. And I'd like to key this off with acknowledging two co-authors. I stole some data from both of them. Barb Crane and Dana Nelson is here. If I am here, can you all hear me okay? Great. So why shortleaf? And we got one of these things. But that doesn't work, so let's try this one. What do I need to do here? There we are. Okay, so I'm lucky. I've got the best job in the Forest Service. I get to drive around and go on tours, host tours, lead tours, experience tours in a set of wonderful and diverse forest ecosystems supporting a variety of habitats across the South, and quite a few of those feature shortleaf pine. That's kind of exciting in itself. Bob, you'll be great. You'll be thankful to know that I didn't use one slide that you sent from New Jersey, because the last time I visited New Jersey was 40 years ago, and I felt unwashed by showing slides of New Jersey when I know nothing about it. So I'm pleased to be here, John, and looking forward especially to tomorrow. So what I'm going to do today is move the projector closer. That doesn't help. Okay. So we're going to go on a virtual tour of shortleaf. Since the third shortleaf meeting, I've been on about 15 different sites, and I just want to go over some reflections of what this experience looking at shortleaf pine across the South has resulted in. Some of you remember this tour, Clarence Coffey showing some of the wonderful shortleaf that's been planted up on the Cumberland Plateau at the Catoosa Wildlife Management Area, highlighting restoration efforts on the Cumberland Plateau of Tennessee, where shortleaf was pretty much wiped out as a result of southern pine beetle activity when in the 90s, 2000s, sites that once were reported to have red-cockaded woodpecker, no longer there, and extensive efforts, mostly requiring planting shortleaf in order to bring that land back. There are, on the other hand, still places where we have shortleaf pine-dominated stands quite literally as far as you can see. Most of those are west of the Mississippi River. As illustrated here, I'm standing in Oklahoma looking back towards Arkansas along the western part of the Ouachita Mountains in west central Arkansas. There is a ridgetop road called the Talamina Scenic Drive that's a hidden gem, rivals the Blue Ridge Parkway for this kind of spectacular scenery. Shawn, this is your stand on the backside of the Mina from 2010. Shawn Cochrane was a district wildlife biologist and burned that stand. This is why I have had trouble coming to Jesus about shortleaf pine, because my experience in the western part of the station's territory indicates that shortleaf pine isn't threatened or endangered or in serious difficulty in any stretch of the imagination, because we have wonderful areas that have been restored using thinning and fire, where a mid-story component that's encroached over the past 70 years has been reduced, and where shortleaf is king. John, rumor has it that some of these trees were sawed up into the 8x10s and shipped to rebuild the boardwalk up at that was destroyed by Hurricane Sandy in Atlantic City. At least that's what the local mills tell us. A third field tour. If you've never seen some of the work that's been being done by Ron Masters, who is now on the faculty at University of Wisconsin Stevens Point. Prior to that was the director of the forestry program, director of research at Tall Timbers, and prior to that was an extension wildlife biologist at Oklahoma State. And in the 1980s, he installed a study on the Pushmataha Wildlife Management Area in southeastern Oklahoma. and basically involved just some subtle variations of thinning and prescribed burning. And you can see from the control stand where a pine regeneration cohort was established in 1984, followed by nothing. A stand that has been planted to loblolly, which was the industry practice at the time, and then a number of different alternatives where we have no thin and no fire, where we have some thinning, cyclic fire, where we've had no thinning and fire every 3 years, and then no thinning with annual prescribed burning, just showing some of the variability that can be imposed on the landscape simply by varying the return interval of prescribed burning. Here, something that McCree knows, some of the Southern Pine Woodland Restoration Tour in the Big Piney in February of 2016. Mid-story thinning and prescribed fire effects after 10 years, which would be about 3 prescribed fires, but those cedars were cut about 10 years ago, and by gosh, they just don't burn up. They stay persistent out there in those understory conditions. And I don't know how long it'll take to get rid of them, but if there's some mechanical treatment that you can use to get rid of cedar, if you don't want that laying in your woodlands for the next 20 years, something else is going to have to be done, and I'm not sure what. The dog bedding or cat bedding industry, perhaps, or something odd like that. But it's an interesting ecological effect that I'd not seen before. Here, again, out in the Management Area 22 in the Ouachitas, where we have the end result of some of the long-term 120-year red-cockaded woodpecker habitat rotations in shortleaf pine, where the standards for Region 8 to recover the RCW call for regenerating those stands using the shelterwood method with natural regeneration. Here's a stand with a couple of age cohorts of shortleaf pine coming in beneath a residual overstory of shortleaf pine. That residual overstory will remain in place indefinitely to provide long-term habitat of trees that eventually decide to rot in order for the red-cockaded woodpecker to take advantage of them. And notice one of the key elements to success, to what I think is successful shortleaf management in the long term in a sustainable way, and that's having a market. Here in a different part of that same area, shortleaf had been planted in the 1980s and 1990s in the 1980s up to the 1990s, fairly extensively. This was the Forest Service's comparison with private industry's efforts to plant loblolly pine across the South. And on national forest lands in West Arkansas and eastern Oklahoma and to a certain extent in southern Missouri, shortleaf was the species that was planted. So we have a lot of 30 to 35-year planted stands of shortleaf that have been thinned and burned, and this stand has been burned 10 times in its 33-year lifespan. So good, regular, prescribed, cyclic prescribed burning creates conditions that look like this. And again, in situations, some of you recognize the standard Forest Service protocol these days for marking first commercial thinning in a stand where the trees to retain are marked in orange. That's what happened there. And the products from that first commercial thinning are off to one of the local mills nearby for utilization. We know how to do this. So the good side of our planting story is that we know how to plant shortleaf pine and can help with that. Here's a planted stand again in 2016, stand established in the mid-80s. It's probably had at least a half a dozen prescribed fires in it and is currently entirely suitable for foraging habitat for our red-cockaded woodpecker. Easy stands to manage. This stand is doing nothing but growing high-quality saw logs. Managing these thinned and planted stands in an understock stand condition is going to be a key to producing a lot of high-quality saw timber in the long term. Now, interestingly, these dense young planted stands are a few degrees warmer in winter, and you can feel it when you're walking through the woods chasing bobwhites, and we have kicked up bobwhite cubbies from stands that look like that. You think, well, where are the birds? What are they doing? Well, I think they're staying warmer to some degree on a cold night in Arkansas. Here was another interesting stand that I'm going to continue to refer to today. Here is a prescribed burn on the Calcasieu Ranger District of the Kisatchie in south central Louisiana, where this neighboring stand had 3 species of our southern yellow pines. It had longleaf, it had loblolly, and it had shortleaf in it. And an arson fire had triggered a wave of natural regeneration in that clear-cut opening, and it was all coming back, and a lot of it was loblolly. And the district managers thought, well, that's not exactly what we would prefer to have in this site, especially because it's within our longleaf restoration area. So they burned it at age 2 and came back into this stand. Most of the loblolly will disappear from that stand. The longleaf, that just is like petting a longleaf on its head. It loves that. And you can see the shortleaf that's in there. I don't know if you can see that very clearly, but that's a shortleaf sprout coming out of the base of that stem. So we're going from 3 species to 2, and the 2 species are the fire-adapted species that tolerate fire at a very young age. I'll come back and talk about that a little bit more. Here we had an international working group. Our international colleagues are very much interested in single tree selection, pro-silva, back to nature kinds of forestry activities. And that means that, and they equate back to nature as cutting 1 tree at a time, a classic Dauerwald selection method sort of approach. They get really intrigued when we tell them that our back to nature treatments really involve prescribed burning in our southern yellow pine stands, because that burning component was the natural feature that was going on here. And they're very much intrigued by that. And especially when you dig up a shortleaf seedling that's had perhaps 4 sprouts over the past decade on it, and every time it dies back as a result of fire, those starch reserves continue to build up in that J-rooted part of the root system and continue to grow. We also did see red-cockaded woodpeckers that day. Well, we still face the question that loblolly grows faster than shortleaf. Now, my National Forest colleagues, I'm about to diss on the National Forest, but I don't intend to in a terribly inappropriate way. In the mid-1980s, we had some sites that were site prepared, that had been clear-cut and site prepared and ready to plant. And the seedling suppliers for shortleaf ran out of shortleaf seedlings. So a decision was made in the regional office. We don't want to lose the expense of all of the site prep that we've been done, and if we wait, it'll just require a subsequent follow-up site prep treatment, which is a waste of taxpayer money. So we're just going to take a handful of those stands and plant them into loblolly. Today, this is interesting because these stands are growing side by side. This is actually one of the shortleaf progeny tests up in the Odin, Dana. And sure looks good, but I don't know if you can see our district silviculturist Cordero France right there with a loblolly pine that's even bigger than him. So loblolly does grow faster, and we're just going to have to figure out what that means for our landowners in whom that sort of volume growth continues to be something that's important. Notice that both of these stands have been burned. After about age 10, you can burn loblolly, that's just fine. But early fires are probably going to be important. We'll get back on that. Mike, I put this one in just for you. You've got to have some degree of avocational interest in the stands that you're working in. Or else maybe you should be inside at a desk. Well, truth is, I'm inside at a desk too many days out of the year, and I just love it when I get to walk through these woods in a recreational context. Chasing bobwhites in this particular instance behind my good friend Larry Hedrick and his dog Chance. Okay, we have taken that shelterwood that you saw earlier, and in February of 2017, my colleagues on the National Forest ran a good prescribed fire through that new age cohort in an effort to try to control some competing herbaceous vegetation. In April, they followed up with a pre-commercial thinning treatment. I probably would have done it the other way around. I probably would have done the pre-commercial thinning treatment, waited a year, and then come back with a prescribed burn, because some of these cut stumps are actually resprouting. So we're going to continue to have that effect. So it's not just a fire-related effect. It's an effect related when you sever the apical meristem and that inhibitory auxin is not preventing the dormant buds from expressing themselves. That's why we see shortleaf so prominently on the sides of roads where the bush hogs have taken them out. Texas is doing some really interesting work in some of their state parks where they have seen some mortality-related effects in loblolly as a result of drought. They're identifying some of those areas where sandy soils are prominent and where they think shortleaf was probably pretty common, and are investing in prescribed burning and some thinning in an effort to develop some shortleaf stands on some of the state parks in Texas. Luther's in here somewhere. The NRCS is taking a lead in helping with some of that work, not directly funding the state, but rather using it for private landowners who might be interested in shortleaf on sandier sites that are adapted to it. On the other hand, we do have some circumstances that illustrate we run into problems when we get much beyond 3 or 4 years in our prescribed burning, in our cyclic prescribed burning. We get a lot of stands that can get away from us. And this is right on the edge of that occurring on the Davy Crockett in Houston. And I just wanted to illustrate that as an example of the need for continued prescribed burning in these stands. Finally, the Temple Forest Foundation, what I kind of call an institutional landowner, has a wonderful little area called Boggy Slough near Lufkin, Texas, again on some of these sandy soils, and they're trying to get some red-cockaded woodpeckers back and trying to develop some high-quality shortleaf pine saw timber, and it looks, the early parts of this effort look like it's really something to follow and to look at pretty excitedly. We also happened, on that same foundation, we also happened to see the Texas state record loblolly pine and a 36-inch diameter longleaf pine, which was probably a mile or two from the nearest other longleaf in the terrain. These mixed stands are magical. There's something about these mixed stands that I don't think we understand very clearly from research and practice. And I think these mixed pine stands are something to be interested in. Finally, I'd heard for many years about the wonderful Montaigne Longleaf up in northwest Georgia on lands that belong to Berry College. Berry brags that they are the largest college by land area in the country, 35,000 acres. A lot of it is in this mountain longleaf, but look what's right next to it. Here we have a longleaf pine and a sprouting shortleaf coming up. That's a longleaf stem, that's a shortleaf stem. This is advertised in the colloquial literature as longleaf dominant. I don't think it is. I think it's probably shortleaf dominant. And it's making me rethink these metrics for what constitutes a dominance in our pine components. And that's got implications for both our longleaf initiative and our shortleaf initiative. So, just to keep going here pretty quickly, importance of planting for restoration. Public lands, I think, are a cornerstone for restoration. Single most important tool, prescribed fire early and often. We need a market for shortleaf timber if we're going to make this in a sustainable way. A broader appreciation for mixed species stands, and loblolly grows faster, so why shortleaf? I'm going to skip over some of this stuff pretty quickly. I want to highlight this. We had data from a couple of years ago that shows that shortleaf is not very widely planted from FIA data. We don't have but 300,000 acres, I'd bet, in shortleaf planted stands across the South. So and most of that's in the Ouachitas and Ozarks. If we're going to be successful in shortleaf restoration, we're going to have to ramp up our efforts at planting a little bit, which had some implications that in Dana and Barb Crane's world for what are the genetic resources and what's the implications of hybridization. Well, Barb did a survey of states to quantify what resources exist for shortleaf, and some interim results from that are basically that state agencies own about 10% of the shortleaf resource. Industry doesn't own anything really devoted to shortleaf. Why? They're doing everything they can to grow loblolly, and they grow it really well. They probably have some expertise that we could tap into to continue to develop our ability to grow shortleaf. But the Forest Service has some 500 acres of first generation, some 20 acres of second generation, scattered at Mount Ida and Stewart nurseries, at a nursery in Mississippi, and at Beech Creek over in South Carolina. And just to illustrate, that's kind of what these areas look like. That's about 500 acres in total. So we have a good supply of genetically improved shortleaf seed that's available. We've got about 4,500 pounds in storage right now. If we decided to grow all of that at one time, we could plant 236,000 acres. In longleaf world, that lasts us 2 years. In shortleaf world, that's about as much as has been planted so far to date in shortleaf pine. So seed supply isn't going to be a problem in the near future, I don't think. By the way, shortleaf cones are persistent, so you can't shake them loose. So it's much more labor intensive to collect shortleaf cones than it is to collect some of the other kinds of cones. And then some of Dana's work, looking at some of this increased hybridization that's going on, and is this going to be an issue in our seed orchards and our seed supply? So Dana tested shortleaf in a substantial way and found what I'd categorize as just a little bit, wouldn't that be accurate, of hybridization in seed orchard trees that's going on. And we know what those are, so we can deal with those pretty effectively, just to illustrate that concept. So you've stood up because I'm running out of time. Let me talk about this one point, and then we'll go from there. Prescribed fire, early and often. The earlier in life, the better. There's more to this story. It's not just really important, it is going to define the future of what we know as shortleaf pine. This paper that was published by Dana and I were co-authors on it. Rod Will at Oklahoma State said fire top kills the crosses and they did not resprout. 60% of the shortleaf pine resprouted after dormant season and growing season burns. This basal crook is important for shortleaf pine resprouting after fire. It's an important tool to reduce the hybrids and to provide a competitive advantage to shortleaf relative to loblolly pine. Rod Will said it best at the 19th Southern Silviculture Conference. It's not that shortleaf is a fire-tolerant species. It's that shortleaf is actually a fire-demanding species. And if we're going to retain the unique genetic identity of shortleaf pine, we've got to burn it, and burn it at young ages as often as we can. And I'd suggest that age 2 is not too early to get your first fires into any stands where you want to try to encourage shortleaf. So with that, I'll stop and turn it back over to Mike.
We've got time for a brief question. I hate to cut any of the speakers off today because all these